Hey guys. This is part 6 of What If Naruto Died and Became a Hollow. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 24 Explosion. When Harabelle's medallion was removed from her neck, she had a huge weight off of her shoulders that she hadn't felt in years. She touched the area around her neck, almost as if the entire thing was just too good to be true. The Shark Hollow began to breathe slightly heavier at the revelation that she was finally free of her long burden. She laughed lightly, a rare event for the usually stoic Hollow, and it was surprising that her laughter had such a beautiful tone to it. It was the Fox King himself who had removed her burden for her, and for that she was incredibly grateful. She looked over, seeing the fox already moving on to the next slave, and using the delicate procedure needed to remove the medallions. She looked to the rear to see hundreds, if not thousands of liberated slaves mingling with each other down at the bottom of the cave. If there was one thing that slavery was good for, it was conditioning them to not eat each other. She turned back to the fox and his 3 underlings who were also helping remove medallions, and noticed a few slaves jump into the crowd, finished with the procedure. The Shark Hollow took a deep breath, and began slowly walking up to her savior. If the fox noticed her, he sure didn't show it, as he was focused completely on removing the medallion off yet another slave, sighing and muttering to himself as he tried to use the right amount of force. He finally noticed her after he had removed the medallion from the slave. He looked up at her from his position, and offered a soft smile, which unknown to her was completely fake. "I'd just like to say that you, as well as your subjects, have my sincere gratitude for freeing me and this multitude of slaves. I would just like to say thank you as leader of the former slaves," she said confidently, also offering him a smile back. "You're the leader of the slaves? I didn't realize that Drindo would have such a thing as rank among slaves. But that's all in the past now, so I guess it doesn't matter," he said, his voice dripping with a sugary tone, one that his 3 generals would notice as being completely fake. "Though you and your fellows seem to be quite excited about this development, and the chance to get your much-deserved revenge on the tyrant. So, I take it you'll be joining us?" he asked politely. Harabelle nodded at that, though not without slight hesitation. "Anything's better than being a slave, and we do owe you for saving all of us, so as the former leader of the slaves, I think I speak for everyone when I say that I swear allegiance to you, and only you," she said, dropping to one knee and bowing her head. All the eyes of her comrades were on her now, nearly all of them accepting or tolerant of this new development. Cheering arose in the air as the slaves uniformly rose a limb into the air as if to salute to their new leader. "Now, there's no need for that, the Fox Hollow trailed off, realizing that he didn't even know her name. "Harabelle. Tia Harabelle," she said, finishing her new king's sentence for him. Right. Harabelle," he remarked excitedly. "It's good to have you, as well as all these liberated slaves as part of the team now. And since you're the supposed leader of all these hollows, it just wouldn't feel right not to give you a certain position of power," he said affably. Harabelle looked slightly surprised that he would offer something like that, and it was made clear underneath her mask. He hadn't even seen her fight yet. "You don't have to do something like that, she trailed off, mirroring Naruto's actions earlier. However, she looked significantly more embarrassed, considering she didn't even know the name of the hollow she would be following. "Naruto. Naruto Uzumaki. Don't call me Sama or some bullshit like that. Just Naruto, so get used to saying that from now on. About your position of power though, I want a 4th general to complete the hierarchy, and you're most likely the best person for the job," he said, dropping all personal feelings and becoming strictly professional. Harabelle looked like she was about to protest to that, but she kept her mouth closed. She didn't particularly care about some position of power. In fact, she had complete and utter apathy about the opportunity to become high-ranked in her new life. Though, despite his friendly demeanor, she didn't believe that Naruto would like it if she turned down such an offer. He seemed dead set on her becoming his 4th general. "I don't think I'm the type of hollow to lead a great number of hollows, Naruto. I only did it under Dreando because I was being forced to, she argued, her voice never changing tone to indicate emotion. Naruto, however, wasn't fazed. Nonsense. You have all the markings of a leader. Look at this, you have the respect and admiration of all the hollows here, and yet you say you don't have the qualities of a leader? You're the perfect choice, and I'm afraid I won't take no for an answer, he said, the sugary tone now slightly more malevolent, though Harabel still didn't pick up on it. Naruto sighed. Okay, fine. We'll discuss this after we get rid of the current threat. I at least expect you to lead these former slaves one last time to destroy Dreando. Myself, Ulquiorra, Grimjow, and Noitra will join you with our own forces. Do I make myself clear? He ordered, an air of finality in his voice. Harabel did nothing but stare, but she at least seemed to accept those terms. The eyes of all her comrades were on her intently, like they were waiting for something like this to happen. She didn't want to let them down. All right, she said finally and simply. Naruto smiled at her. Good, now's your day of reckoning, Harabel. With our combined forces, whatever Dreando can throw at us won't really affect anything. He turned to his other 3 generals. Round up all the leader hollows assigned to the colonies, and order them to lead the hollows under their jurisdiction to the top of the plateau. We're going to take this war to Dreando, and make his army actually fight. Noitra and Grimjow grinned at the opportunity to spill some blood, before turning to one another and glaring. Ulquiorra simply nodded, not caring about the prospect of fighting one bit. Harabel, considering you have defected from Dreando's forces, you should be able to tell us the size of his army and his current location. I need you to tell us all you can so we can properly prepare the attack, Naruto said after turning to Harabel, who nodded her head slightly. Dreando's current location if directly outside, underneath this plateau. When he attacks anything, he will always wait a not-so-safe distance away from the action, while the slaves do all the work. He's very overconfident like that. It's a major flaw I know we can exploit, because he did not bring the full extent of his army to combat you. Even now, the reserve of slaves he owns is far greater than the amount of actual troops he has, though they are much more efficient and well-trained than slaves are, she explained. He's below us. That's good. Harabel, can you give me a rough estimate of the number of hollows that can use ranged attacks that are in this group? He asked seriously. The other hollows seemed to be listening as well, as when Harabel gave a sharp whistle, those who were mainly ranged fighters separated to one side of the cavern. Naruto grinned. There were a sufficient amount of them. Okay, the group of ranged fighters is going to accompany Harabel towards the top of the plateau. There you will remain out of sight to support the close and medium-range fighters as they attack Dreando. However, he turned to everyone this time. It's likely that someone will pick up that something's wrong with the Ryatsu, so you'll have to be quick. The rest of you will go down to the bottom where Dreando and his army are located. Try to get the jump on them and hold your ground. We will arrive within a few minutes. When Dreando is finally killed, it is then that we will truly claim victory, he proclaimed, and the rest of the hollows cheered. Naruto held up his front paws, silencing the group after a few seconds. Shall we go then, Ulquiorra, Noitra, Grimjow? I leave this group to you, Harabel. I have great trust that you'll be able to lead them to victory, he smiled, the sappy tone once again convincing her. With that, the 4 male hollows left through an opening on the ledge they were occupying. A few minutes they had unsealed the doorway leading out of the deep pit, allowing Harabel and her group to exit and take the fight to Dreando. Naruto, was that wise? Lying to her like that. If she's going to become the 4th general, how do you think she'll react when you let your true nature come forth? Asked Ulquiorra, slightly wary of the Sharkajuchas. Naruto grinned obnoxiously as the 4 hollows walked down the narrow corridor. He really was getting somewhat good at this manipulation business, but he supposed it had something to do with his previous career as a shinobi. He sighed wistfully at Ulquiorra's statement, being in high spirits ever since he had recruited so many hollows. Necessity, Ulquiorra. Necessity, he replied, looking back to stare at the 3 confused hollows. I just saved her from a terrible life, you see. She wouldn't dare try anything even if my true nature is revealed. She's too indebted to me for that to happen. Did you see the look on her face when I told her she could be completely free of Dreendo? I plan to build on that, making her completely reliant on me and only me, if she isn't like that already, he explained. In a way, I guess you could say that she hasn't escaped her old life, he cackled, to which the other three hollows got what he was saying. Neutra and Grimjow laughed along with him. What the hell are they doing? Dreendo asked himself, sensing the lack of fighting noises from inside the plateau. The place was desolate, no noises, no Ryatsu spikes or anything else that could be considered signs of a battle. His guards around him didn't even stir. That's it, when they come back, they're going to be in for one hell of a punishment, he ranted, the guards finally looking at him stoically, yet not without a little hint of exasperation. Dreendo-sama, if we just give them time, I'm sure they will. Fuck that, they need to, he began childishly, but he cut himself off, noticing some shadowy figures attempting to hide on the precipice above. They looked somewhat familiar. Oh, there they again! The king was cut off as soon as he noticed that it was his slaves. This time, some of the slaves were huddling behind outcroppings, and from the top of them they launched a multitude of ranged attacks. From spines, to pellets, to corrosive liquids, to seros, they rained down upon the huddled army. Dreendo's eyes widened underneath his hood, as an unprepared soldier to the right of him was hit by a spine to the chest. The thick spine penetrated to the left of its hole, spilling red blood from the deep wound. The soldier collapsed to the ground, heavily wounded. All in all, about 12 or 13 members of his army had been hit by the first wave of projectiles, and even he had to block an oncoming one with his thick hollow skin. Now the slaves who had remained out in the open were storming down the plateau, while the projectile-launching hollows remained and began to launch another wave of attacks. Those idiots, he muttered to himself. The slaves are rebelling. Stand your ground and fight back, he roared, and his army personally readied themselves for a fight, something they hadn't done in quite a long time. They were used to just being overseers, watching over and abusing the slaves and making sure they were kept in line. Dreendo signed, he would need to make an example out of a few of the slaves, which would make them deplete in numbers. He held both of his arms out, letting a few small pricks of red Ryatsu to appear on the palms of his hands. Say good night, as he activated the Riryoku that he had kept stored within 10 of the medallions that were around the slaves' necks. The red Ryatsu in his hands went from a few pricks to a full-blown torrential flame, before disappearing completely. He blinked, and nothing happened. The slaves continued to rush his army, who by this point had become a disorganized mess that clearly wasn't going to be able to deal with the situation at hand. He tried again. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing. The guard to his left was by a large, round pellet to the head, which completely caved in his mask and destroyed his brain. Some of the blood flecked onto Dreendo, but he was too enraptured to pay attention to what was going on around him. What the hell is going on? He shrieked at the top of his lungs, much to the amazement of the hollows around him. He frantically looked around for an answer to this conundrum, until his eyes locked on Harabel, who was leading the pack of hollows down towards them. He focused in on her neck, and to his surprise, there was nothing around it. In a panic, he turned to look at a few of his other slaves, and noticed that there wasn't anything around their necks either. Oh crap! The slaves had finally descending upon them in a blaze of glory, combating the soldiers in the army with ferocity that no one would expect in bodies so withered. The slave hollows were using their own methods of attack against their foes. Most of them were attacking with slash attacks, or biting them and feasting on the corpse afterwards. That is not to say that the soldiers were completely outmatched though. In fact, the battle seemed to be somewhat even. His army had taken to using seros on their foes, an attack which sometimes worked spectacularly. Harabel herself was cutting through soldiers like a weed whacker, her oversized shark-finned sword doing a fantastic job at it too. Her attacks had feeling too, they held all her hatred, her anger, and her sorrow. She was quite the sight to behold in battle. And yet she was carving a path of dead soldiers straight in his direction. So, she's heading for me, eh? Well, I'll show her a thing or two about how to fight, he thought. He gestured to his soldiers around him to give him a wide berth, and they didn't need to be told twice after witnessing their master fight, not to mention the rampaging sharkajuches that seemed to be coming straight at them. Harabel didn't waste any time with small talk. The normally stoic Hollow, in a rare display of excessive violence, leaped an impressive distance into the air, and raised her natural weapon over her head. "Die, Dreendo!" she roared, slashing down with all the force she could muster. She didn't care about how the attack left her open, she didn't care about how much stronger than her this Hollow was. All she wanted was to watch him die. Unfortunately for her, this was not what she was going to see at the moment, as Dreendo deftly dodged the attack skillfully. He glared at her with sunken eyes underneath his hood, before he took a red arm and ripped off his hooded cloak. He was blood red from head to toe, the only difference in color being his always white porcelain mask. He was about the same height as an average human male, though his build was far stockier than one of them. The features across his body seemed roughly equivalent to a human's as well. He possessed arms and legs like them, as well as a torso like them. But he also seemed to have sharp fingers and toes, things that could easily be used as claws. His mask was vaguely humanoid, except it was a little more angular than a human's face. He also had 3 hollow tubes, one protruding out of his forehead over to the left of his mask, and 2 that came off of his cheeks to curve upward. Harabel wasn't fazed by this, and she thrust her weapon out again. Dreendo sidestepped it easily, and sonitoed right in front of her. After getting underneath her guard, he punched her rapidly a good number of times, before thrusting out his hand in a jab, which was augmented by his sharp fingers. Harabel was thrown back by the unseemingly powerful attack. He was a Vasto Lord, so she knew that she should have expected him to have such power. His blows were strong, and not lacking in finesse either. And his sonito was smoother than anything she had ever seen before. Yet she was convinced that this was only the start of his abilities. "Harabel, what is the meaning of this?" he spoke, his voice tinged with deadly seriousness. He looked at her now bare neck again, which she noticed, and adopted a somewhat smug, mocking expression on her face. "What happened to your medallion? Who removed it?" he hissed, tranquil fury overriding any rage. For the first time, he released his full Ryatsu, a crushing force that instantly wiped the smug smile off Harabel's face, and replaced it with a look of pure fear. She shouldn't have rushed in like that. She shouldn't have angered a Vasta Lord. And she was going to pay dearly for it. All she could do is wait for the backup that Naruto had promised her. "Well, guess what, Harabel? This little rebellion of yours is going to cost you your life. Don't think I'm just going to sit here and let you do all of this. I'll use you as an example to all the pathetic little bestas that think it's a good idea to rebel. I'm sure they won't take kindly to their precious little leader dying such a slow and painful death," he said melodramatically. Harabel readied her fin sword again, though with her look of fear and slight sweating underneath the pressure, the young shark Hollow hardly looked intimidating, especially to a far older, more experienced Hollow. "Well, here as goes. I don't think I've really mastered this move yet, though." She charged up her Ryatsu in preparation to fight. It was a smooth yellow color, but as she finished her preparation, water began to form around the surrounding area. Dreendo watched her, slightly intrigued but not so that he would pay attention to this in any great detail. His former leader slave was now pointing her weapon at him, and water began leaking from the 3 slits of the blade until it covered it completely. "La Gata," she muttered, firing the concentrated mass of water at her opponent. It flew at him as a great speed, though not anything that could outrun him. He disappeared into a flash at once, before reappearing next to Harabel's side. The action caught the Hollow off guard when it really shouldn't have, and she was thrust backwards as Dreendo nonchalantly backhanded her. He stared at the blood that now coated his knuckles, before glancing at the downed Harabel and snorting in pure disdain. "Oh, please, Harabel. Do you have any idea how predictable that was to avoid? Guess what? Firing away at point-blank range doesn't work unless you've got something to hold your opponent in place. Any experienced fighter knows that," he lectured. Harabel struggled to her feet. The attack had knocked the wind out of her, but it wasn't too threatening. Dreendo still looked bored. "What did you really hope to accomplish by fighting me? You think that you'll defeat me if you keep this up?" he said before he gave a loud, obnoxious guffaw not unlike a certain fox Hollow. "Give me a break. You're just a lowly Ajuchas, and a bestie at that. I don't even need to use my special abilities to be able to defeat you. You would lose even to a humanoid Ajuchas, considering how inferior you besties are. Your little surprise attack is the only reason you've managed to harm my army. In time, we are going to push you all back, my little slave, he said perversely. Harabel grimaced. It was true. They were beginning to get pushed back. The soldiers had seemed to gather their morale, after going without a fight for so long, and the weaker, abused slave hollows were started to get killed more often. She stared as a hog-like hollow was pierced through the heart by a wiry limb of a soldier. This only added to the amount of casualties that were beginning to pile up. Where the hell was Naruto? You see, even without the medallions you never stood a chance of being able to escape. I would give you a chance to stop now and return to me, but I'm not that nice. You've crossed the line, Harabel, and you have to be punished for it, he said, walking up to the Ajuchas. Harabel tensed up at that, before slashing at him again with her weapon. Several times she gallivanted around, firing water attacks and slashing with her fin sword. Yet they didn't so much as scratch the Vasto Lord, as he either dodged or tanked the attacks. She did a back flip after avoiding a jab from Drindo, but that turned out to be her fatal mistake. As she flipped, Drindo took the opportunity to seize her neck, before effortlessly lifting the hollow into the air. He squeezed tightly, not saying a single word, yet keeping his soul-piercing gaze on Harabel. Those were eyes that promised nothing but pain and death. To Harabel, it was pure agony. Her airways were completely constricted, though Drindo seemed intent on snapping her neck rather than having her suffocate to death. She grunted and moaned as she struggled in midair, but Drindo's grip didn't falter in the slightest. Just end it. Don't draw out her suffering. Clank. Harabel was roughly released from the Hollow King's grip, and dropped to the floor where she began gasping for breath. Drindo himself wasn't focused on her anymore. Rather, he was focused on the small little projectile that was currently wedged within his arm. To be able to penetrate his defenses, this object must have had incredible reiatsu behind it, no matter how slight the wound was. He yanked it out of his skin roughly, scrutinizing the jade-green stone covered in blood. Another dart hit the ground near his feet, causing a massive crater almost 20 feet in diameter, that the humanoid king sank into. This time, he was able to see the exact spot where they were coming from. Good shot, Grimjow, grinned Naruto, at the panther who had launched his claw darts over at the king, saving their fourth general from imminent death. The panther growled in response, his blue eyes still intently focused on his prey. Him, hissed Drindo, as he saw the damnable fox hollow who killed his brother for the first time. He knew it was him, with the way he seemed to be leading around the other hollows. Speaking of other hollows, the plateau was being swarmed with reinforcements, hollows that appeared to be different than the slaves that they were currently engaging. They must have been a part of the fox's kingdom, and they were here to back up the slaves. Things might have gotten a whole lot worse for him. He looked over to the left slightly, and noticed that there was a small panther hollow to the fox's side, who seemed to be the one who was launching those darts at him. In addition to the fox, bat, and panther, there seemed to be an insectoid figure, though Drindo couldn't see much of it at this distance. He then had a sudden realization. Wait! Harabel, don't tell me it was those fools who removed your medallion, he said to the downed hollow, who was still catching her breath from when Drindo almost killed her. He took Harabel's lack of response, and turning away from him as a yes. Ha! He chortled roughly. Are they so pathetic that they need to list the help of slaves to add to their forces? But they seem to be all besties, so I guess that I should expect this kind of behavior, he mused. But still, I'm perplexed on how he managed to remove all those medallions. I designed them myself to hold hollows in place, and the only person who I ever told about removing them was. He trailed off, as his voice cracked near the end, and his sunken eyes popped out and his stance became more rigid. Oh, that son of a bitch! He roared, his face a somewhat amusing display of annoyance. He must have taken notes about my weaknesses in that damn book of his. Then that fox hollow also knows about the secrets contained with that tome. The tome that was handed to both of us by him, he said, his voice going far lower. The situation just got far more serious. It looks like I'll have to handle this myself. His eyes panned. The 4 hollows up there seemed to be making their move, as the last of their own hollows flooded out of the cave complex. The panther and insect hollows seemed to be rushing down the plateau. They were clearly eager to spill some blood. The Fox King himself seemed to want to join the battle, and he even locked eyes with Drindo from what he could tell. The bad hollows remained up there, supervising as all the other hollows began to flood down the precipice. The bat hollow then took to the air along with a few other hollows that could fly, and launched a Zero down on the battlefield that obliterated 5 or so of his weaker hollows. The panther and insect had broken into the main area of the battle, and they were tearing it up with a ruthless efficiency. With the panther's speed and the mantis' strength, the two were seemingly unstoppable. The mantis was covering the left, and the panther was covering the right, but the fox was cutting straight through the middle, heading straight towards him in a similar manner as Harabel did earlier. The overconfident king prepared to face him with hand-to-hand combat, but before he could react, the fox zipped away with a speed Drindo didn't think was possible from an Ajuchas. Eyes panning, the king was too late to notice the young hollow flash into existence directly above him, and score a direct hit with his paw right to the side of his mask. The impact jarred Drindo somewhat, though his tough defense held through for him. Still, this was no normal Ajuchas. It must have eaten his brother after it killed him. Even though it wasn't enough to make him evolve, it would still grant him an enormous power boost. Yet, Vasto Lord, he was not. The victor of this battle was still clear in Drindo's mind. "Get yourself to safety, Harabel," Naruto said, flashing a wide, and clearly fake, smile at his newest general. "I'll handle this from here on out," he said, turning his back to her and staring intently at Drindo. The shark hollow's eyes almost watered underneath her mask. She had been saved yet again by her new king, though years of seclusion had left her weak and useless in a fight. She nodded gratefully to him, before she got up to her feet and headed for another section of the battle, away from her greatest adversary. As he turned back to the fight, he noticed that Drindo had recovered and had focused his full attention on him, whereas before he had never taken his eyes off Harabel even as he was rushed by Naruto. "Not so fast, boy!" he screamed, as the shock of the first attack wore off, and Drindo delivered a punch of his own to a Naruto who was rushing in from behind. It was a heavy blow, and though Naruto dodged quick enough to avoid any serious damage, it had injured him quite a bit. Still, despite being downed, he got back to his feet and tried again, using the same rush-forward strategy he had abused during the times when he was still alive. "What are you, stupid?" Drindo roared, reeling up for another attack. "I can predict this so easily." He grabbed Naruto around the fox's neck, similar to what he did to Harabel. But Naruto was prepared. He had charged up a Zero during his rush, and with his face directly in front of Drindo, he fired at point-blank range. The attack singed Drindo, and obliterated some fighting hollows behind the two kings, but Naruto wasn't done yet. Using his prehensile tails, he jabbed one straight into Drindo's chest. The tail didn't penetrate Drindo's skin, but that wasn't what Naruto was worried about. As he recovered, Drindo started laughing at Naruto's pathetic excuse for an attack, but halted when he saw that Naruto was focused on something. "Impacto de cola," he whispered, before he began a disturbed giggle, excited at being able to use his newest attack in an actual battle. Out of the hollow portion of the tail that was attacking Drindo, a thin beam of Ryatsu lanced out and through Drindo's body. The beam was thin, much thinner than a Zero, but it was highly concentrated, perfect for a high defense like Drindo's. He roared in pain as he felt the surge of Ryatsu burn a hole straight through his left hip. Naruto began laughing madly, and the laughter became mixed with gurgling as he then took a heavy punch from a rage-induced Drindo. He fell and slid over 30 feet through the dirt, coming to rest at the feet of a few hollows who were fighting. One of Drindo's soldiers lit up when he thought he saw an easy kill, but he was gutted before he could even think about attacking. An already recovered Naruto wheezed in laughter as the soldier's organs spilled from his body, and he had the perfect idea of what to do with them. He picked up the soldier's stomach, before taking a bloody bite out of it and chucking them at Drindo. The other king avoided the entrails easily, becoming infuriated at this bestie's disregard for the dead soldier. He picked up the kidneys, casting a shit-eating grin at Dreendo before devouring them completely. Blood drooled obscenely from his mouth, before Dreendo glared at him. I don't think hand-to-hand combat is going to work anymore on this hollow. He's too sneaky and cunning for me to get anything more than a few shallow hits on him. I guess that means I'll have to use my special abilities. But on such a lowly bestie, I must be getting really rusty in my skills, he thought to himself. Dreendo then took a deep breath and calmed down slightly, closing his eyes as his rage subsided completely. Naruto was perplexed by the odd behavior, but he continued to tear a hole in the body that was now just a husk. He snapped his eyes open, glowing with his signature blood-red Ryatsu that matched his skin tone. The tube on his mask grew slightly larger, and they glowed with a Ryatsu unlike anything Naruto had ever seen before. It had a red outline around it, but as it entered the interior, it became orange and eventually yellow, giving off the appearance like it was something melting. Dreendo grinned, but there was something so off about that grin that it might as well have been one of Naruto's. The tubes around his head began to hiss, until 3 pellets, about the size of peas, were ejected from the tubes. They glowed with the same Ryatsu that surrounded the tubes. Get ready, 'cause you're dead, he muttered before he threw the pellets straight at Naruto. The fox hollow in question, sensing the pellets were something dangerous despite their appearance, threw the husk of the body he had straight at the pellets, colliding the flesh with the Ryatsu. Boom! As the pellets hit the body, 3 large explosions about 20 feet in diameter erupted from the pellets, obliterating the body and sending both Naruto and an unprepared Dreendo flying back from the force. All the hollow's attention was drawn to the blasts, their eyes enraptured on the power so much that they temporarily stopped fighting. Until one of the soldiers shouted, "Run away! Dreendo-sama is beginning to use his true powers!" he roared before turning tail to fight somewhere else. The rest of the soldiers turned to run as well, but the former slave hollows and Naruto's army weren't allowed to let that happen. They used their advantage to slash and attack the fleeing soldiers, letting the alive ones know that they weren't going to escape so easily. "You fools! We have to get out of here. With Dreendo-sama using his power, none of us are safe. You'll be caught up in his blast too," shouted the hollow who had warned everyone previously, but his pleas went on deaf ears. "Save your breath, pal. We're here to make sure we drive you off Naruto-sama's land. We're not about to be afraid of what your leader can supposedly do," said a hollow in Naruto's army, to which the others roared in agreement. Dreendo pulled himself to his feet, wiping his mask free of dirt, and didn't waste any more time. He charged up his fists until they were actually hissing with the strange Ryatsu he possessed, before he darted into the battle even faster than he had been previously. Naruto shook his head as he got to his feet. That was unexpected. What was the strange Ryatsu that Dreendo seemed to possess? Explosive Ryatsu? The fox could see why such an ability could be considered deadly. "What the?" he spluttered as Dreendo appeared in front of Naruto, his fists charged with explosive Ryatsu that was just begging to be released. "Holy shit, no!" he screamed in his mind, as he dodged out of pure instinct as the fist came down on him. At the last second, he hopped over Dreendo's head right after the punch was released, falling clumsily onto the dirt below. Time seemed to stop for a second, as the desert was dead quiet for just a split second as Dreendo stood there with his fist cocked. But then, all hell broke loose as an enormous explosion was released from Dreendo's punch, and dozens if not hundreds of hollows on all sides were engulfed within it. The hollows in the vicinity stopped fighting, and those who used a weapon dropped theirs, as they stared wide-eyed at the pure destruction that Dreendo had caused. Then they roared, and hundreds of hollows fled the area, going in whichever direction they thought was safest to escape to. Some even trampled over their fellows as they moved. Dreendo wasn't fazed by any of this. He turned away from the chaos and smoldering bodies, to see that Naruto had escaped by just a hair on a reflex. Dreendo looked down upon the fallen hollow, who was breathing heavily while glaring at the Vasto Lord. "Get up. You're not fucking done, Fox. You're gonna fight and die here, and I will claim Terobik's possession, that great tome he had, for myself," he said, addressed the air with pure disdain. "Wait, how do you know about that book?" Naruto asked. On the skies above the battlefield, Ulquiorra surveyed the fight and destruction that Dreendo had brought. Grimjow and Neutra were far away from Naruto, away from the blast, but their attention now seemed to be on the main fight as well. That's one deadly ability you're up against, Naruto. How do you think you're going to handle this one? He said calmly, never feeling any worry at all for his new king. Yet, somehow, he felt the need to go over there and help with the fight, and if anything Grimjow and Neutra seemed to be thinking the same thing, as they were slowly plowing the line of hollows to reach the fox. Ulquiorra sighed, it looked like he would have to do something too. And with those words in mind, the Bat Hollows sped over to where the battle was taking place, intent on turning the battle in their favor. Chapter 25, El Assessor. Know about it? Drindo asked, raising an eyebrow to Naruto's question. Todoroki was my younger brother, and he had possession of that book. He even added his own notes to it, about how he could counter my attacks, among other things. How could I possibly not know about it, eh? Naruto glared at the king in response to that, as he rose to his feet and averted his gaze before dropping into his usual stance. The fight wasn't going to go in his favor if Drindo kept using those abilities of his. What the fuck, man? I fight my way over here just to notice you getting your ass kicked hard by this fucker. What makes you think I'm gonna follow such a useless king after this display? Came a rude, taunting voice. Naruto turned and glared even more murderously at the taunting voice, only to find Neutra fighting his way through the end of the thicket of battling hollows. He didn't seem to care that he harmed former slaves or hollows in his army. Not that Naruto himself cared regardless. But the Fox Hollow really wasn't in the mood to put up with this shit, so a quick release of his superior Ryatsu made the Mantis Hollow shut his mouth in a second. The three hollows in the vicinity stood in awkward silence, until it was broken by a fourth presence making itself known to the group. Grimjow, like Neutra, had fought his way through the crowd of hollows to make it here, though he was being uncharacteristically silent. Well, isn't this funny? The king, who seemed to boast so big before, is now being backed up by two other hollows in a 3-on-1 fight. How ironic! But I guess it just can't be helped. After all, I am a Vasto Lord, and you all are a bunch of lowly ajuches. It makes sense that he was cut off by a blue zero that he avoided somewhat clumsily. If a zero to the head is what it takes to make you shut up, I'm going to hate killing your ass, said the grumpy Panther Hollow, who was clearly the one who fired off the attack. Drindo was about to say something insulting back towards the hollow, but they were all interrupted by sound of flapping wings. They looked overhead, and noticed Ulquiorra also flying in from over the waves of hollows, to land gracefully at a spot in between Naruto and Grimjow. The Bat Hollow didn't say a word, but he looked at Neutra with a condescending glare, like he didn't approve of Neutra's little display of insults to Naruto. Neutra sneered and almost pouted, knowing that Ulquiorra was very much more powerful than he was. Oh, now come on, guys. This just isn't fair to me. Now you've got that damnable Bat Hollow joining the battle. Isn't there any way you can spare me someone to fight for me? Drindo said childishly. He was only met with glares. Guess not. Looks like I'll just have to make do with what I have. Even against 4 high-level ajuches, my abilities should be more than enough to finish the job, he whispered to himself. With those words in mind, Drindo sped off, leaving his 4 opponents on guard. The king appeared right next to Neutra first, considering him the weakest target, due to the fact that he was slow and his incredible defense could be breached by him. What are you doing, you ass? Roared Grimjow, as he noticed Neutra was going to fail to stop Drindo's attack. Ulquiorra, sensing the Mantis Hollow's failure, using a surprising boost of speed to propel Neutra out of the way of Drindo's attack. Neutra went skidding through the dirt, grunting and cursing as he ultimately was out of harm's way. Drindo followed through with his explosive punch anyway, managing to nick Ulquiorra on his right wing. Despite just barely tapping it, the explosion was enough to almost completely obliterate the wing, leaving only a foot of torn leathery material growing out of Ulquiorra's backside. Neutra sat there rigidly, feeling somewhat numb from the fact that he was saved by the Bat Hollow. He looked up to see the bat's wing already repairing itself via high-speed regeneration. The lack of feeling that Neutra quickly turned to anger and seething hate, as the Bat Hollow turned to the Mantis and gave him a look of pure disdain and contempt. If you're just going to get in the way like that, then why don't you go somewhere else where you can actually make yourself useful to someone? The Bat Hollow said acidly, much to the ire of Neutra. It was like Neutra's inferiority complex took a major blow right where it hurt, and one could actually hear Neutra hissing out in hate that was directed at Ulquiorra. "You bastard," he hissed. It was barely audible, but the weight it seemed to carry was far greater than anything yelling ever could. While Neutra openly hated Grimjow with a burning passion, he couldn't say the same towards this Bat Hollow. Until now, that is. He just seemed a little emo, a little faggy for Neutra, but he always stayed out of his way. And now that there was a damned woman of all things getting a position of power equal to him, he hated all three of his comrades. What the hell was Naruto thinking, appointing these guys that rank? Ulquiorra wasn't fazed at all by the hate directed at him, instead just opting to attack Drindo. Neutra then got to his feet, seeing how despite being attacked by Grimjow, Ulquiorra, and Naruto, he wasn't being fazed in the slightest. In fact, he was fighting fluidly, dodging every single strike with perfect ease. He also seemed to be patiently waiting for the right moment to attack. The time when Drindo had had enough was when Naruto attempted to slit his throat after Grimjow had given him a suitable opening. Drindo, like any Vasto Lord, wasn't about to fall for such a simple trick. He purposely slid back to avoid the attack, and then let 3 pellets fall from the tubes on his head before using Sonido to disappear. "Get away from it!" Naruto roared, as time seemed to freeze as the glowing red pellets fell to the ground. Without any hesitation, Naruto used his weight to buck Ulquiorra and Grimjow out of the way, before taking cover himself. The pellets exploded in a fairly small explosion that Naruto had expected, one that wouldn't have been able to do more than seriously injure them should they be caught in it. The purpose of the attack became clear to Naruto after that. Drindo hadn't used that attack to kill. Rather, he simply used it as a distraction and as a chance to regroup and go on the offensive. The Vasto Lord was simply toying with them. "You guys, if we're just going to get in each other's way, you shouldn't be here. Our advantage in numbers is useless if we don't know how to properly work as a team, which we don't. Go back to your solo battles, and don't regard me in the slightest. Just destroy the enemy," he shouted at the 3 others, before Drindo could attack. Then Naruto heard a whooshing noise that he noticed was heading towards Neutra. "Oh shit," he thought in his mind. It seemed that Drindo was determined to wipe out the least dangerous to him first, proven by how he seemed to always attack Neutra when he could go for any one of them. He had to do something if he wanted to save his second general. Without even thinking, Naruto himself sped over to Neutra's position, who didn't seem to notice that we was under attack. Roughly, Naruto shot one of his hind legs out, and kicked Neutra with all the force he could muster. The Mantis Hollow went flying back into the battlefield 100 feet away, but Drindo was still coming. The swipe meant for Neutra would have taken off his head and made it explode, but Naruto was apparently very good at reacting reflexively. He fell to one of his front paws, dodging underneath the first blow, before he used his momentum to propel himself away from the explosive kick that Drindo tried to combo him with. Unfortunately for him, the explosion was large enough to catch him while he was dodging, and the Ryatsu seared one of his legs until he was roaring in pain. He fell to the dirt with a thud, looking at his now useless back left leg. The Fox Hollow attempted to stand, but while he got 3 of his legs up, the injured one was just too painful for it to move. He couldn't even force himself through the pain to stand. His leg was shot for the time being. Ulquiorra and Grimjow, seeing that Neutra had flown somewhere else and Naruto was incapacitated, realized that their odds of winning took a dramatic drop. And that was basically true for them. Drindo had clearly had enough of fooling around with them now that his main target was incapacitated, so he decided to stop holding back so much. Using the power of levitation sought out by hollows, he appeared next to Ulquiorra at a speed faster than he had ever shown, and slammed the Bat Hollow to the ground with a crashing explosive pound. The explosion lit up the night sky in a brilliant display of red and orange, and made anyone who hasn't fled a safe distance already do so. Needless to say, the impact and explosion almost killed Ulquiorra. In fact, it would have killed Ulquiorra if it wasn't for his amazing high-speed regeneration. Luckily, none of his internal organs had been ruptured, but he had lost both of his wings, legs, and one of his arms from the impact. At the very least, this would take a while to recover from. When Ulquiorra impacted, he wouldn't have bothered to get up even if he could. He had been defeated, and unless Grimjow could perform a miracle and defeat Dreendo, then he would be killed here. So, the Bat Hollow just lay their face first in the dirt, waiting for either the release of death or the defeat of Dreendo. And while Ulquiorra lay there in his own personal crater, Grimjow stood undauntedly across from Dreendo, never backing down from any sort of fear, though he already knew that he wasn't going to win. Off in the distance, around half a mile away, a lone two-legged figure watched the battle unfold. He breathed in the powerful Ryatsu, and knew at once that he would have to intervene. He stood on a very tiny mesa that barely rose 10 feet off of the landscape, and his expression didn't belay any sort of emotion. Looks like my fears were correct. I was hoping that when I told him that information, Dreendo wouldn't set his sights on his kingdom. But I was too naive, hoping that the conflict between brothers would have been resolved by now, and Terobik would have moved on. At the very least, though, it looks like Terobik is no longer a part of this situation, though whether he's dead or not, I don't know. Still, Naruto is no match for Dreendo at all, so I have to hurry, the figure said. Valakav Almazan had wandered into these parts once he heard word of a new kingdom sprouting onto this landscape. He was told from a passing hollow that the kingdom had been destroyed by Dreendo in its early stages, but its king apparently hadn't been at the scene when it had occurred. He hopped off the rock and stopped his ramblings when he saw an explosion erupt onto the battlefield. He broke out into a run, hoping he would arrive there before Dreendo prevailed. He was much closer to the battlefield when he saw another explosion burst onto the scene, this time in midair. He watched as a bat-like hollow plummeted to the ground, clearly dead or severely injured from that blast. Dreendo was in sight now, clearly the one who had caused that last attack. He seemed to be standing over a fallen panther hollow, who was barely alive and able to move. The panther shook for a moment before it collapsed, clearly defeated by the superior hollow. All that time, Dreendo stood over them smugly, not a scratch across his body. It was when he noticed Naruto on the ground that Dreendo began walking towards the 3 downed hollow. He looked upon them like he was some kind of malevolent god, before he walked up to the panther hollow first, raising his foot over his head to crush his skull. The horned hollow broke into his fastest sonito, before appearing in front of a surprised Dreendo. Before the red hollow could bring his foot down on Grimjow, Valakav grasped Dreendo's leg, hoisting the other hollow into the air and flinging him elsewhere. Dreendo managed to land on his feet, though he still slid away almost 50 feet. He glared at the new arrival with pure hate, which even deepened when he noticed who the arrival was. Valakav, he hissed, as he stared down the other hollow. Valakav stood his ground, before he turned back to view his descendant on the ground in a pitiful state. The two locked eyes with nothing but blank expressions, like either of them knew what to say. It was Naruto who finally broke the silence. Valakav, what are you doing here? He asked, wincing as he tried and failed to get to his feet again. The old hollow turned away from the much younger one, seeing Dreendo stalk his way up to them. I decided to travel here after I had learned that some fresh new hollow had managed to start up a kingdom in a place I recommended him to. However, I see you've managed to make Dreendo your enemy, so I'm here to step. Just sit there quietly and let me do all the work, he trailed off. Naruto looked like he was about to protest, but he lay his head down low in defeat, finding that there was nothing who could in the situation regardless, before he fell unconscious. Dreendo had finally done it. Well, he shouldn't say finally, as that implies that realistically he wouldn't be able to do this in the first place. He knew that this fox hollow was no match for him, as a king and as a fighter. But he couldn't help but feel happy as both him and the bat hollow lay defeated and at his mercy. They would both die here today, along with the annoying panther hollow that he had just defeated. He would finish off the panther hollow first, him being the least of his worries and the one he didn't want to take revenge on. He walked up to them while grinning evilly the whole way, and raised his foot in preparation to finish the dirty deed. However, just as he was about to bring his foot down in the most audacious display of overkill ever, his explosive kick was blocked, by an outsider of all things. He felt his leg get lifted into the air, before he was thrown back away from his prey, skidding and taking a look upon the newest interloper. He hissed when he saw the disfigured hollow. Gray skin, a horn mask, and a necklace of 6 bones that hung around his neck. Not to mention the buboes that coated his entire body. Valakav, he hissed, recognizing the familiar hollow immediately. He hadn't changed one bit since their last encounter, and that wasn't since, never mind. He had never had a good relationship with that one anyway. He noticed that Valakav was putting distance between them and the downed hollows, making it clear that he wanted to keep them from dying for some reason that Drindo couldn't fathom. Valakav was being his usual silent self, though he was glaring at Drindo like he had committed some kind of mortal sin. Drindo walked up to him, closing the distance between them. Valakav, don't think it's been so long that I would have forgotten you. What brings you to this neck of Hueco Mundo? Surely it isn't to protect those weaklings, is it? He said casually but forcefully. Valakav's face didn't change. Drindo. Surely it isn't too much to allow these kids to live? After all, there are plenty of kingdoms within Hueco Mundo, and you haven't expanded upon yours in years. Is it so hard just letting them be? He asked, trying to appeal to Drindo. Drindo walked closer, until the two Vastolord were standing 5 feet from each other, staring each other down. Yes, it is Valakav. This Fox Hollow has wronged me in so many ways. For starters, he instigated a rebellion amongst my slaves by removing their medallions, which has already caused the deaths of many of my own men. He trailed off. Valakav wasn't fazed. Secondly, he killed my brother, he said lightly. Not to mention, he's read El Libro de Ciclos. He knows the weakness of my slave medallions and instigated this rebellion. In addition, he must know about the other things that Torobik mentioned about in the book. Valakav, after getting over the initial shock that Naruto of All Hollows has read the legendary book that even he hadn't read, smiled mockingly afterwards at Drindo. So, that's what this is all about, he said. You aren't doing this because you want to avenge your brother or anything. You're doing this because you want to take advantage of the opportunity to snatch that legendary book away from a hollow much weaker than Torobik. You were afraid to go get it before because you know Torobik could have beaten you with all the knowledge he has. He turned back to look back at Naruto. Even with his knowledge of your weaknesses, Naruto lacks the power to be able to defeat him. The one-on-one fight you had with him speaks for itself. Though I do wonder how he managed to defeat Torobik. He added the last point as an afterthought. Drindo looked mutinous, though he didn't outright deny the accusation. Instead, he looked to left over towards Naruto's cave complex, no doubt thinking of the secret that lay within it. So what if that's the case? This fox doesn't deserve to know the secrets of that book if he's that weak. Since I'm Torobik's only relative, that automatically means that the book belongs to me. To me. After I kill all of you, I'm going to claim my rightful property. He shouted, any aspect of control now completely gone. It looks like talking with you isn't going to work after all. I should have realized this in the beginning, he said, lowering himself into something similar to a shinobi's taijutsu stance, something a bipedal creature like him would find advantageous. Whatever. The sooner we get this over with the better, he said, holding his hand below the tubes to allow a couple more pellets to drop directly into its palm. Shall we? Valakav asked, as the bones around his mask glowed 6 separate colors, 7 if you count the one that was both black and white. His body hissed with pure energy, something that startled the unconscious and defeated hollows awake. Ugh, my head! Grimjow moaned, clutching 2 of his paws to his mask. He then noticed the other Vastolord, but he was too injured and stunned by Ryatsu to move. Who's this guy? He asked to both his king and fellow general, who had also woken up. Okuiara seemed to genuinely not know about the mysterious Vastolord, but Naruto was a different story. Valakav, he hissed, remembering Valakav's saving of him. Anyone else would have been grateful, but Naruto instead was confused and angry at being treated in such a way. Again, no less, considering how Valakav butted into his rampage on Konoha. Valakav walked forward some more to keep them out of harm's way. After that, he held his arms out horizontally, and his black and yellow eyes gained some strange circles around them. Ah, Los Ojos de Samsara. I remember it all too well, Valakav. Didn't you once say that they were the remnants of some power you had in life called the Rinnegan? Drindo said, catching a few more pellets that he had created. I see you remember well, Drindo. While it is true my hollow techniques have some resemblance to my old Dijitsu. Unfortunately, I lost the Rinnegan after I died, and with it I lost the ability to understand the nature of chakra. While I may have carried over some of the Rinnegan's abilities, the ability to understand the nature of Riryoku and the ability to use the 6 paths has disappeared. Riryoku is much more powerful than chakra, but it is almost ludicrously more complex to understand. There's no way I'd be able to understand it. He stopped walking. However, despite losing the ability to use the 6 paths, and the ability to understand the energy around us, there is one ability that Los Ojos de Samsara retained. It can manipulate spiritual wavelengths to a certain degree, allowing me to pinpoint and use 6 separate wavelengths of Riryoku that change the properties of it. And that ability can be called in some circles, he disappeared, his Sonido being roughly the same speed as Drindo's. He was at Drindo's side instantly, to which Drindo reacted violently by throwing the pellets haphazardly at him. The field was lit up with a few small explosions again, but Valakav wasn't fazed at all. Element manipulation, he whispered, as he grabbed onto Drindo's shoulder and threw the other Vasto Lord crashing into the ground. Valakav stared at him lightly, before stomping his foot down on Valakav's torso. Fuego ofensivo, he said, as flaming Ryatsu gushed from the appendage that he had on Drindo. However, the other Vasto Lord took advantage of the time between when Valakav had taken weight off him, and he used Sonido to disappear and leviate it high in the air. The blaze that emitted from Valakav's foot spread over the dirt over a 30-feet radius like a wildfire. Drindo fired a Siro from his hand down at Valakav, which was charged with his explosive Ryatsu. Tierra defensivo, he said, letting his earthen Ryatsu flow into the dirt around, which almost immediately responded. Soon, there was almost like a small earthquake underneath their feet, until the dirt cracked, hardened, and formed a defensive sphere large enough to protect both him and the defeated hollows almost 100 feet away. The Siro impacted the hardened dirt sphere with an impressive amount of force, though the explosion was not enough to breach through the wall. The explosion was contained outside of the sphere, but its radius was greater than anything that Drindo had shown thus far. Valakav let the dirt wall fall as soon as it was safe, panting at the amount of Ryatsu he had to unleash to keep that thing intact. Drindo's explosions were impressive to say the least, though his real merit was when he used it in hand-to-hand combat. Drindo seemed to think like this as well, because as soon as Valakav dropped his guard, he was in close range, firing away with explosive punches that Valakav had to deftly avoid. When Drindo came in for an explosive left hook, Valakav knew he was in trouble. So, he did the only thing he could think of in such a small window of time. He matched the explosive punch with a punch of his own, coated in fire Ryatsu. In hindsight, that was probably a bad idea. The two volatile punches collided with each other, creating an explosive discharge that neither of them could control. It exploded in their faces, throwing both Vasto Lords backwards and wounded both of them at about the same rate. Such a high-level hollow battle, whispered Ulquiorra over to the side. Though, that really was an amateur mistake made by this Valakav. He's clearly not as skilled as Drindo in hand-to-hand combat. All three hollows seemed to think the same thing, as Valakav's success was what their lives depended upon. Drindo got to his feet and laughed, clearly amused at Valakav's failure despite him being injured as well. What's wrong, Valakav? Have the years made you rusty? You seem a lot weaker than when you were younger, he commented, as Valakav pulled himself to his feet. Relámpago ofensivo, he whispered to himself, as he fired a weak but very quick bolt of lightning from his finger. It took him so little time to fire it that Drindo wasn't even able to react. It seared him right through the shoulder like a laser, crippling his left arm. Drindo howled as another hole was drilled through his body, this time making his arm useless. That was a good move. He didn't have to waste any time for hand seals like he would have to while alive. That lightning bolt was so quick I don't think anyone could have seen it in time. And by crippling Drindo's arm, he just upped his chances in hand-to-hand combat, said Naruto begrudgingly, even though he didn't like to admit that Valakav was good in battle. He fired off another bolt, this time not even saying the name of attack, but the near-invisible bolt of lightning didn't even hit Drindo, who by now had wizened up and was on the move. He did a feint attack like he was going to punch from afar with his good arm, but the last second he appeared once again at close range. He attempted an explosive uppercut to propel Velikav into the air, but the other Vasto Lord wasn't about to fall for such a simple trick. He ducked his head to the left, avoiding the attack entirely. Drindo tried to combo him with a few kicks, but he avoided as well. As he sprung back into position while Drindo was recovering from his own attacks, and clapped his hands together while they glowed with red Ryatsu. This allowed a burst of fire to come exploding from them, hitting Drindo at close range. The slave-holding king flew back, the flames scalding through his defense and damaging his skin. It seems like Drindo doesn't have a tactical approach to just about anything. Velikav is definitely outsmarting him every step of the way. I'm surprising such a bumbling hollow became a Vasto Lord. Okiura added off to the sidelines. You dirty bastard. You haven't changed at all since the days we spent as Baragon's advisors. You still like to play cheap, no wonder you managed to climb the ranks and lost no chase. Drindo growled, now steaming mad. Like that matters. Anyone who made it to our rank as advisor had to do their fair share of backstabbing in order to make it there. You were no different. I still remember you conspiring to overthrow Baragon himself, when he didn't completely share all of your ideals. Velikav retaliated. I don't care about that anymore. Baragon may have been my hero when I was a young, stupid hollow, but nowadays I realize how much of a fool he is. He provides refuge to Bestis. I lead my afterlife in that kingdom underneath the ideal that Baragon would one day purge the kingdom of those hollows. But no. They just kept continuing to grow every single year, and I couldn't take it anymore. I had no choice but to take down Baragon, because he trailed off, before he gained the most bloodthirsty look of hatred that wasn't even reserved for Naruto. He's the one who kept that book out of my reach for so long. A few hundred feet away from the site of the battle, Neutra twiddled his sharp fingers in the dirt, occasionally rising to take out an enemy hollow that attempted to attack him. His dumbass king had kicked him out of the way of that last attack, preventing him from the death he always yearned for. He supposed that wasn't right though. He wouldn't have perished with honor, dying on his feet in the best battle he had ever had. No, he would have died like a little screaming bitch who was just in the way and complaining about his king. That wasn't the right way to go. He grit his teeth, almost drawing blood inside his own mouth. What would become of his pride if he was going to get in the way all the time? Didn't they understand how much this hurt him? He heard some distinct sounds over across the battlefield, and saw Harabel tearing her way through Drindo's forces. A woman. Didn't they understand how he couldn't stand having a woman be equal to him in battle? No, they didn't understand that at all. They never would, as long as they lived. He supposed he was kind of grateful for the promise of power and the chance to battle, but they didn't understand his inferiority complex. Chapter 26, Drindo Waiterobic. Years before the main storyline. Baragon Luzenbarn wasn't always the most powerful king in all of Hueco Mundo. There was once a time when he was just like an ordinary hollow, except with the strange desire to see Hueco Mundo change, and at the center he would rule it all. He wanted to be king of this godforsaken place, and finally instill some order into the world that knew nothing but violence and instinct. He had been at least somewhat successful thus far, having recently risen to Vasto Lord after merely 20 years as a hollow. He had also gathered up a good number of powerful hollows who believed in his cause, even though it was nowhere near enough to begin a kingdom. He mirrored Naruto's path in just about everything, minus the pure sadism that formed Naruto's personality. He had even found himself a right-hand man in the form of Velikav, though more often than not he took on the role of an advisor. However, Baragon couldn't shake the feeling that he was somewhat out of place with the rest of them. Out of the 500 or so hollows who currently followed his lead, most if not all of them were either civilized, or afraid of retribution should their bloodthirsty nature ever come out in front of the others. Velikav, on the other hand, was the closest there was to a normal hollow. Borderline psychotic, the strong Ajuchas was only here because Baragon got to him early, and the fact that he was clever, and gave such good advice. Berrigan doubted he could have gotten so far without him. The whole group seemed to be eking out sort of a nomadic lifestyle, until they could gather enough numbers to be able to form a permanent settlement. These were dark times, even for Hueco Mundo. There was a disturbing lack of a central organization, such as a kingdom, which could bring control to Hueco Mundo, even if it was only slight. Berrigan was aware of an empire that spanned nearly all of Hueco Mundo, and could probably even rival Soul Society in power, but it had collapsed several centuries ago due to a reason unknown to Berrigan. However, he did know that one could find remnants of this once great kingdom in its capital, which was located near the ocean. And surprisingly enough, there were rumors that its emperor was still out there somewhere, biding his time. He turned back towards his future subjects. They seemed to be sitting stoically, either in the tents they had managed to create, or out in the open. Occasionally, one of the more restless hollows would resist the urge to eat. Berrigan was still an idealistic young hollow. He wasn't stupid enough to believe that they could unite all hollows, given their nature, but he believed that a fair number of them cooperate with each other, and only eat those outside of their kingdom. His attention was cut from the condition of his subjects over to an even younger Ajuchas that seemed to approaching him easily. His appearance wasn't flattering, being an ugly gray, and he seemed almost devilish with the way his mask was formed. Still, he had a cocky and hot-blooded expression on his face, coupled with no little amount of bloodlust. Berrigan, he began, not even slightly respectful in the face of his leader. I believe we have stayed here long enough. The other hollows are aware of our presence, and have reacted accordingly to avoid us. Prey is becoming slim, and though you became a vasto lord and no longer have the need to eat, the rest of us will eventually be affected. We will soon need to find new hunting grounds, he said. Berrigan nodded, surprisingly understanding of their current predicament. He looked over the encampment again, and spotted that his newest recruits seemed to be faring the worst. They were a pair of young Ajuchas brothers who seemed to have become hollows together. The younger was definitely the more laid back of the two, and only joined him for an easier chance to get food. The older, however, seemed to be slightly on the power-hungry side. They both seemed to have become Ajuchas only recently, and the older one seemed to be getting intoxicated by his own power, which was admittedly very high. There came a shriek from the middle of the encampment, as a particularly large Ajuchas rose to his feet, howling in what could only be hunger. Berrigan grit his teeth. He knew it was only a matter of time before something like this happened. The Ajuchas howled violently, throwing its sinewy arms around and scattering the surprised hollows around him. I can't take this anymore. I need to eat, he roared, as he took a bite out of a normal hollow who was unfortunate enough not to get away. The other hollows gave him a wide berth, as he chewed the remains enthusiastically. The Ajuchas hissed psychotically, the small meal doing next to nothing for his hunger and bloodlust. He stalked outwards, towards the two Ajuchas brothers, who were casually sitting there. The hollow roared again as he charged the two Ajuchas, and raised one of his limbs in preparation to strike the two smaller Ajuchas. One of the Ajuchas, humanoid and blood-red in color, rose from his seat with startling fluidity, and caught the Ajucha's limb in a surprising display of strength. The other Ajuchas reared back in shock, but not before his opponent's arm glowed with a riatsa that seemed as hot as the sun. The larger Ajuchas didn't have time to react as the clutched appendage exploded in a blaze of glory, now only a stump attached to the main body. Ag! You bastard! The Ajuchas roared before he collapsed to the ground. His future killer allowed a look of bloodlust to pass through his face, while his brother watched the fight stoically off to the side. Without saying a single word, the humanoid Ajuchas wrapped his hand around the downed Ajucha's throat, squeezing tightly while allowing the hot riatsu to glow vibrantly. Then, all of a sudden, he allowed it to explode, creating a fountain of blood and a now headless Ajuchas. The other hollows in the camp murmured to themselves, all the while backing themselves away from the battle's victor. He went back to join his stoic brother, but not before noticing that both Berrigan and Valakav had their eyes on him. Berrigan was watching him as stoically as his brother, while Valakav seemed to have a look of glee on his face, as if this was a hollow whom he could control. The two top hollows looked at each other in understanding, before Berrigan gestured his advisor to follow. As they approached the two, the look of stoicism on both of their faces disappeared into a look of respect. They bowed deeply, each of them muttering, Baragan-sama, Valakav-sama. Valakav snickered, but Baragan said nothing for a few seconds. You two, what are your names? He asked finally, his tone never betraying anything unpleasant, just a simple curiosity. The two weaker hollows in front of him answered immediately. Drindo, said the older brother, while the younger one muttered Terobik. Drindo and Terobik, eh? Those were some superb fighting skills you just displayed right there, Drindo. It would be perfect, because I'm feeling a little lack of authority in these hollows. The two of us can only handle so much, so I need some positions of power other than myself and Valakav. He explained to the disbelieving Ajuchas, who knew where this was going. I think you two are perfect for the job. A stream of lightning connected with Drindo's arm, singing it somewhat seriously. He was just in time to stop one of Valakav's horns from impaling him, but couldn't stop the tricky and cunning lightning attack that followed. What's wrong, Drindo? You never could keep up with me, even in your prime while an advisor for Baragan, Valakav taunted, trying to get the words to sting close to home. Says the hollow who had everything taken away from him. My kingdom is still intact, unlike yours, thanks to the stable influx of bestie slaves. But you wouldn't know about it, would you, since you and that pathetic Baragan never supported the use of slavery? Drindo retorted, creating a lance of explosive Ryatsu and launching it at Valakav. The Vasto Lord avoided it easily, though the attack engulfed several fighting hollows where it fell a good distance away. He was about to follow up with an explosive punch, but Valakav beat him to it. Agua defensivo, he muttered, throwing a not too impressive splash of water onto the battlefield. However, at the sight of it, Drindo ceased his attack. He knew what that was, the water that could nullify any type of energy attack, including his explosions. True enough, the water glowed a bright green, giving it an unnatural hue. The water covered the distance between the two combatants, and Drindo knew he couldn't touch it, lest he lose the ability to use his strongest attacks. He needed to act quickly, before Valakav followed up with his. The humanoid king noticed Valakav go into a stance he was all too familiar with, and panicked against his will. He used Sonido to cross the gap of water without touching it, but it was too late. Agua offensivo, Valakav said, raising his hands in the air as the water came to life in the form of large bubbles that levitated in the air. Shit, Drindo said, as the bubbles morphed into little needles that were threatening to rain down upon him. He sonidoed into the air and darted away, but the water then morphed into a tentacle which traveled at great speeds towards him. Drindo attempted to buck it off of him, but the tentacle was too versatile and speedy even for him, and the strange greenish water wrapped itself around his left arm, which was the easiest place for it to capture. The water swung him around in the air for a while, before throwing and smashing him into the earth, before seeping in the arm. Drindo gasped as the water seeped into his arm. His left arm was now next to useless in the fight, as the seeping of the water negated his ability to use anything but physical attacks. Physically attacks seemed to be what Valakav was going for though, as he didn't give Drindo any time to recover before appearing in his face, and slamming his powerful fist into the face of the weakened Vasto Lord. It would definitely leave a mark, but Drindo wasn't down for the count. He failed to notice the fox hollow that was getting to his feet after being knocked unconscious. Now, make sure you two find something interesting down there. We don't want to return to Baragan empty-handed, called Valakav to the two hollows who were exploring a cave complex near the sea they had recently discovered. Despite being top advisors for Baragan's kingdom, they had been ordered to lead an expedition team to the Far East. Valakav, itching for adventure and a fight or two, wouldn't hear about being left behind. The other hollows around them gave grunts of agreement, prompting Drindo to lash out in annoyance, while Terobik simply looked on ahead towards his goal. Figures that most of the hollows accompanying us would be animal hollows, he muttered to himself. He was definitely getting annoyed with them, after noticing that they seemed to be much rowdier than humanoid hollows. He had to train these assholes, for God's sake. He noticed a few grunts ahead of him. Terobik seemed to have taken out a few enemy hollows. This proved that this cave complex was inhabited, but he doubted anything there would pose a real threat towards them. Yeah, we'll find something to bring back to Baragan so this expedition wasn't a giant waste of time for everyone, called back Drindo, not really caring if Valakav had heard him or not. The humanoid Ajuchas was getting a lot grumpier after many years in Baragan's forces. He had joined for power, and was even awarded a high position in the kingdom that gave him importance over the other hollows. So, why the hell didn't he feel much stronger than the day he was recruited? It was because his king was always turning his attention to the weaker hollows instead of him. Where was the power that Baragan had promised him all those years ago? It was given to the new hollows that were rapidly joining the kingdom, most of them animal hollows. He was cut from his thoughts by his brother, who told him that they should continue moving. His brother was an animal hollow too, he realized, taking the shape of large gray ox. He had adjusted reasonably well to Lost No Chase, never demanding any power like he had, yet he still managed to grow stronger than him. "Yeah, I'm coming," he called unenthusiastically, the voice drowning out whatever Valakav had called back towards him. He didn't know whether Valakav was still talking after a while, because they had moved deeper into the cave so that all voices from the surface would be drowned out completely. Drindo was thoroughly surprised about this place, though he didn't let it show. It was Valakav's suggestion that they explore this place, probably just to make them do more work. The Blood-Red Hollow had simply expected an empty cave with a few hollow here and there, but the place actually seemed to be some remnant of an ancient hollow civilization. There were torches on the wall that lit the way, and occasionally they would run into a few wall paintings that seemed to tell some kind of story, though he couldn't figure out what. Torobik wasn't paying any attention to the walls, though that was just like him to not really care about anything. He was being cautious enough to stay on his guard though, as they both knew an attack could come at any time. They descended down this long spiral staircase that seemed to be the main hub of the complex, until the two hollows came across this large, worn-out door. It seemed weathered with age, but the few ornate designs it had left on it seemed to indicate that it led to somewhere important. Torobik clutched the handle carefully and pulled, allowing the door to creak open with a small degree of effort. He peered inside before his eyes focused on something that apparently was of interest to him. "What is it? Do you see something, Torobik?" Drindo asked, when he wasn't getting a response from his brother. The younger hollow turned back towards Drindo, his eyes fraught with confusion, but thankfully not worry. "A book?" Torobik said lightly, his voice just as confused as his eyes. Drindo raised an eyebrow at the odd proclamation. "A book? What's a book doing in a place like this?" he asked. "I don't know," said Torobik, as he swung the door open. "But whatever it is, it seems to be really important. I mean, just look at it." He pointed into the room, where Drindo saw the ornate, golden-bound book sitting on a crude pedestal of sorts, almost like it was a shrine. Drindo stepped into the room cautiously, subconsciously thinking that this was some kind of trap that would set off the moment he touched the thing. He vaguely noted a stone chair of sorts in the back of the humongous chamber, but it was unoccupied. He sauntered up to the book carefully, scrutinizing it before he came to the conclusion that it was safe to touch. The torches in the background shone on the book, giving it a sort of holy, or unholy, feel. After a tense few minutes, he reached out and grabbed the book, grimacing while thinking about the trap he set off. Torobik, who was still outside the room, bunkered down and prepared for it as well. However, when the trap never came, Drindo was able to get a good look at what he had taken. It was lighter in his hands than he had expected, and as he flipped it over onto its front cover, he noticed that there was no title. Just a strange cross-like pattern that seemed to abundant all over the cover of the book, its spine included. He caressed the spine of the book lightly, the strange vibe he was getting from the tome intensifying. He was about to open it, but as he did he felt a strange chill creep down his spine, just like he was being watched by something. His brother seemed to be feeling it too, but it went beyond a simple hunch, as he saw a pair of mustard-yellow eyes peer at them from a small opening to the right of the throne. "Drindo, look! Enemy!" Torobik shouted, pointing to the eyes that panned from Drindo over to Torobik in the instant that he said that. Drindo dropped the book immediately, before falling into a fighting stance to meet the current threat. He noticed the eyes right before they disappeared, and a solemn figure walked casually out of the cave complex. Probably just a weak hollow looking for an easy meal, he thought to himself, before a crushing Ryatsu, even greater than Baragan's, both paralyzed him and his brother. The humanoid Ajuchas fell to his knees, breathing in heavily from the pure force that weighed down on them. The figure came into full sight, and what a sight it was! A chimera-like hollow, one that was clearly a Vasta Lord, walked out of the small passageway, grinning at the downed hollows. Drindo managed to raise his head barely, taking in the hollow who had the body of a lion and the mask of a snake, while two antlers protruded out of the reptilian mask. Its body was a deep yellow, going along with the lion theme its lower body was going for. It was strange, but Drindo thought he saw this particular hollow on some of the cave drawings on their way here. It was crude, yes, but there was no mistaking that body. Another strange thing was that he always seemed to be surrounded by a large key at his foot, while a tome was tucked underneath his arm. Well. It seems I have some rare visitors to my domain. The chimera spoke, its voice a mixture of the hissing of a snake and the growling of a lion. He released the pressure on the two weaker hollows, though they didn't dare attack him after that display of power. It seems you're not completely stupid. Almost any other hollow would have attacked me right there, he mused, a sly grin coming onto his face as spotted the book at Drindo's feet. But, it seems you've taken an interest in El Libro de Ciclos. I don't take very kindly to those who would steal my belongings, especially since that book contains all of my records from when I ruled, he commented, his voice raising a bit near the end. Wait. So you wrote it, wheezed Robic as he climbed to his feet, still looking worse for wear. The chimera's attitude seemed to dampen at that, and he sat on his throne, slouching a little. Yeah, it's my compilation of all the discoveries I made during my time as ruler. Not to toot my own horn or anything, but I made quite a few discoveries during that time. He trailed off, and no one said anything for a little while. But it doesn't matter. None of it. I lost it all when I overestimated my own abilities, and attacked the Soul Society. My kingdom, and all of the hollows in it. Drindo's eyes widened significantly. Wait, kingdom? Your kingdom? Then that means, the rumors were, he trailed off. Allow me to introduce myself. The name's Reporo, ruler of the ancient kingdom you've probably heard so much about. Indeed, I once ruled the vast majority of Hueco Mundo, and I even had the power to rival Soul Society, or so I thought. He explained. At the height of my power, I discovered the secret to Arancarization, and with that, I was unstoppable. Around 500 years ago, I attacked Soul Society in search of another thing that I made a discovery about. The attack went somewhat successful. With my forces, we managed to kill 9 of the 13 captains, and eliminate over half of the total Shinigami. I even made it to the realm of the Spirit King, in order to consolidate my victory. But the Royal Guard, coupled with Yamamoto Genryosai, was too much for me. Our forces were repelled, and the objective I searched for fell out of my grasp. I just barely managed to escape back into Hueco Mundo, but my beautiful kingdom was in tatters. I have lived in regret ever since. Reporo finished. Drindo suspected that the old Vasto Lord simply wanted someone to talk to after all these years. In hindsight, I have nothing left. Everything in that book I already know. So, thinking about it, you can have it. These last 500 years have humbled me completely, and if someone can find a use for my discoveries, go for it. The secret of Arancarization is in there. You'll be able to do great things if you become an Arancar. Drindo stared numbly at the book, never having interrupted during Reporo's tale. He was just gonna give it to us. According to him, the secrets behind this book were incredible. Hell, it would be very valuable if the only thing contained here was the secret to Arancarization. Please leave me be. Take it and go. Reporo said solemnly, clearly taken back by all the memories he just recounted to them. Drindo didn't say a word, deciding to leave the old hollow to wallow in his misery. He picked up the tome, apparently the last vestige of the greatest hollow in existence, and left, leaving the old hollow down there alone. As they headed back to the surface, their eyes were glued to the text in awe at what Reporo had discovered. The secret to Arancarization was the main topic of the book, and already Drindo's mind was swimming with the amount of power he could obtain. So much more than what he could have in Barragan's kingdom. Terobik seemed to have the same idea, at least somewhat, and it was rare to take this kind of interest in power. As they neared the exit, they could see one of their hollows looking back at them before he scampered off, no doubt to tell Valakav that they have returned. So you have returned. I think it's about time we head back to Las Noches. We've been out here long enough, and Barragan can't go more than 2 years without us. Why don't you tell me your findings as we head back? Said Valakav. Drindo and Torobik looked at each other, before Drindo stepped up with arms around the book. No, I don't think we'll be going back. Eh? Drindo smiled evilly. I have a book holding the most powerful secrets to Hueco Mundo in my hands. Why would I want to go back to some ass-backwards kingdom that hasn't made any advancements in years? I think it's time that Hueco Mundo learned of the name Drindo. Naruto awoke with a splitting headache, but that wasn't important right now. What was important was that bastard Drindo was still out there and kicking, and that Valakav had shamed him immensely. He launched a Siro out of frustration, which clipped 2 more fighting hollows and alerted both Drindo and Torobik of his presence. Oh, so that kid's awake again, muttered Drindo, more out of frustration than amusement. Valakav seemed somewhat perturbed by it as well, as he knew Naruto would be a handful if he were awake. Drindo! He roared, rushing into battle again, uncaring of his downed comrades. He only had one goal right about now, and that was eliminate the enemy in front of him. He attempted to tear into Drindo as fast as he could, scratched, tearing, biting, and firing Siros at the Vasto Lord. But Drindo took them all with fluid movement, proving how feeble such attacks were to him. But the arrogant Vasto Lord missed one thing. Fuego ofensivo! Roared Valakav, as he slammed his fiery fist into Drindo's torso, which propelled the king forward, allowing Naruto to strike him with his hind leg up into the air. The fox sonidoed up there, raising both claws and slashing across his torso with them, creating deep gashes that formed an X pattern across his torso. The king fell to earth, but Valakav knew he wouldn't be defeated by that, so he prepared for it. Agua ofensivo, he cried, spreading a pool of the deadly water across the ground. Naruto caught the hint of where Drindo was supposed to land, and before the king himself could recover, he was kicked downwards in the pool of water. The water almost scalded Drindo's skin, but it began to yet again seep into it, stripping him of all his explosive powers. For a time, Drindo and Torobik ruled together, forming a surprisingly stable kingdom on the island where Drindo's current kingdom lay. Both of the brothers managed to rise to Vasto Lord using the book's help. But as time went on, Drindo started to get greedy trying to figure out the secret of Arancarization, while Torobik began to tire of being in his brother's shadow as supreme leader of the kingdom, and his apparent racism. Drindo, is this really necessary? Asked Torobik, seeing the numerous slave hollows digging a deep burrow beneath the island. Being an animal hollow himself, he was very uncomfortable with his brother's methods, but never raised this concern to him personally. You know it is, Torobik. The book says that in order to become Arankar, one must find of the 86 bolas de evolution that have been here since the beginning of Hueco Mundo. These orbs of light forcibly remove the boundaries between Shinigami and Hollow, allowing the Hollow to become Arankar. While some Hollows have stumbled across the bolas and become Arankar unintentionally, this will be the first mass Arancarization since the great times of the ancient kingdom. It is completely and utterly necessary. And the diagram of Hueco Mundo left in the book detailed the locations of 85 of the 86 bolas. And the closest one is underneath our very island, which is why I am using the animal slaves to dig it up. But, Torobik, I am the older brother, and more powerful than you are. You may be second in command, but I can still turn you into an animal slave like the bestie that you are. So I suggest you stop arguing with me before I lose my temper, he said curtly. Torobik glared at him intensely, but Drindo paid him no mind. The younger brother of the two swept back into the castle, his mind made up on something he had to do. Later that night, the shadow of an ox crept through the castle's walls into a small chamber, where El Libro de Ciclo set itself upon a pedestal, much like the time when Reporo was the holder of the book. No security system as usual. It's a wonder how my stupid brother hasn't been assassinated yet, he muttered to himself, grabbing the book easily and without any traps being set off. He was aware that Drindo would come after him, so he took the next half hour to write his brother's weaknesses in the side margins for future reference. He crept out of the room and into the main hallway again, watching himself for guards who might answer to Drindo instead of him. He almost sighed in relief before a low voice resounded next to him, its tone filled with betrayed hatred. "Going somewhere, Torobik?" it asked. Torobik's breath caught in his throat as he turned and laid eyes upon his brother, who was surrounded by a platoon of Ajucha's guards and glaring at him fiercely. Torobik backed up and held the book protectively. Drindo waved his hands, sending his personal set of guards out at his traitorous brother. Torobik looked around for an escape before the whole kingdom would be after him, but he had to cut off his thinking to hit the first guard in the jugular. There, he thought, seeing a glass window on the other side. He propelled himself past the line of guards, but he was stopped at the window by his similarly skilled brother, who tried to cut him off with an explosive punch. He parried the thing easily, before throwing himself through the window and levitating in midair. He gallivanted about the castle, looking for the nearest Leviathan hollow so he could escape towards the mainland. The cave complex where Reporo was sounded like a good place to hole up, and prepare himself for Drindo's retribution. Don't let him escape. He has El Libro de Ciclos. We need that book to tell us exactly how to active the Bolas de Evolution. We won't be able to evolve our forces without it. Drindo roared, sometimes even forcing his guards to get a move on. Drindo would attempt to capture his brother 16 times after Torobik holed himself into the cave complex. Each time would be a failure, and Drindo would gain a deeper hatred for animal hollows. He also never saw El Libro de Ciclos ever again. Shit, that was a close one. I'm glad that didn't Drindo cut himself off, as he realized finally just where he was sitting. In a pool of Valakav's dangerous water, which had all soaked into his skin. No. He screamed in his mind, baking away from the pool of water and back into the dirt again. A bead of sweat rolled down his face, and that was when he noticed both Naruto and Valakav looking at him, evil grins on their face. Valakav stepped forward, prompting Drindo to step away, his true cowardly colors revealed now that he was powerless. The former Rikuta Sannin punched, causing a sickening crack to appear on Drindo's mask. He flew back several yards from the punch, landing in a heap of ways. It was Naruto's turn now, and the fox appeared in his face in an instant, again not giving Drindo any time to recover. Normally, an Ajuchas like him wouldn't be a problem, even in his weakened state, but he was so worn out from fighting that even Naruto could lay a beat down on him. The fox hollow slashed him across the eyes, causing a cry of pain and a spasm of pleasure from Naruto. He clutched his mask, desperately trying to keep the blood out of his eyes, but to no avail. He was blinded, and with no way to stop it. Although he couldn't see anymore, he definitely felt his airways being constricted as Naruto hoisted up the feeble king easily using only his front right paw. Drindo coughed up blood violently, and gurgled loudly. The rest of the onlookers noticed the commotion over there, and slowly but surely, the fighting died down at the mesmerizing display of Drindo about to be defeated. Drindo's vassals had a look of fear on their face for the condition of their king, while those on Naruto's side were simply confused about what was happening. Wait, we can talk this over, Naruto. I swear I'll leave you alone. I'll even give you my minions as slaves. Just please let me live. I don't need that book anymore. In fact, you can have it. Just he gurgled out his ramblings, though Naruto wasn't paying attention to any of it. And no, he whispered, as the younger hollow tightened his grip around the Vasto Lord's neck, his choking getting more intense. He passed through muscle and sinew easily, and Drindo felt it as his bones began to crack. Blia, he moaned, as his vision began to get very blurry. Naruto gave him one last shit-eating grin, but wasn't even gracing his presence or status with any kind of words. Squelch! The hollows around them gasped in surprise, as Naruto's paws didn't just go through bone, but obliterated Drindo's neck completely. It was an explosion of blood and muscle tissue that scattered in a nearly 10-foot radius around the pair. Naruto became drenched in the life fluid, but with his red coat of fur and armor, it wasn't that noticeable. Drindo's head fell to the ground with a thump, lifeless eyes still screaming in agony. Naruto grinned at it, and picked up the head and placed the head next to the body. He noticed Valakav walking up to him, but he was still reveling in his victory to attack the other Vasto Lord for shaming him. "About time someone took care of that asshole," he muttered, as Naruto smirked at the body. His ears perked up at the low scream, and noticed that Drindo's troops were scattering in every direction, desperate to get away now that their king had fallen. "Cowards, every last one of them," he muttered, tripping one running in his direction before tearing his throat out. "They're just like humans," he said distastefully. "Well, they are humanoid," pointed out Valakav. Naruto hummed to himself. "Yeah, I guess it's a given that they're very similar to humans. I think I've decided that I don't need any hollows like them fighting for me." "Well, do what you want then. I've had a bone to pick with Drindo for quite a long time, and I've fulfilled my desire to bring him down. The rest is all you, so I think I'm gonna wander around Hueco Mundo some more," he said before stopping. "Oh, by the way, since it is your kill, that means that the body is all yours. This would be your second Vasto Lord meal, would it not?" said Drindo, as the last winds just came out as a whisper on the wind as he sonitoed away from the battlefield. Naruto didn't even notice him leave. "Oh man, this is gonna be good," said Naruto with glee, as he stared down at the carcass of Drindo. He peered over to the side, and noticed that any of his generals hadn't woken up yet. Oh well, he could tend to them later. Drindo's troops had shuffled out completely, but Naruto swore he would kill them all later. Right now, all there was around were the hollows in his kingdom, still staring at him in disbelief that he had taken out a Vasto Lord of all hollows. They seemed to be waiting for his next move. Naruto didn't need any more prodding. He ate the head first, it being the most delectable to him, before he began tearing and chewing into the body. The other hollows looked at him in envy, but he didn't pay them any mind. He was so engrossed on the great flavor. He tore out a rib of meat and ate it, savoring every last bite, before a sudden feeling came over him. The bone clattered to the ground, it and the leftovers of Drindo being forgotten as Naruto began to spasm. It felt like he was going puke, but he simply fell to his knees and began breathing heavily. His mustard-yellow eyes rolled to the back of his head behind his mask, and little wisps of orange ryatsu began oozing off the young hollow. He gave a hideous roar, even more primal than his normal ones, towards the heavens, scattering all the hollows in the vicinity. And then, what was just a little ryatsu became a full-on torrent of it, forcing the weaker hollows to their knees to begin breathing heavily along with their king. The orange ryatsu concentrated where Naruto, becoming a tornado of the stuff with the torrent of it blowing outwards towards the mass of hollows. In the center, a figure glowing an even brighter orange took on a remarkable resemblance. The confused hollows stared at the spectacle in pure awe, not realizing what was happening until they finally came to their senses. And when they realized what was happening, they all dropped to their knees and bowed. Chapter 27, El Reino Animal. The swirling vortex of ryatsu that was once Naruto continued to buffet around for over 5 minutes. The other hollows didn't dare move from their position to get a closer view, as they would surely be torn to pieces the instant they touched it. They didn't even move a muscle from their prone from bowing, as they knew that their king deserved no less than their full respect with what he was about to become. As the vortex of ryatsu finally began to dissipate, the hollows around watched with bated breath, almost begging to know what had happened to their king, or whether he was all right. Although the torrent had disappeared, there was still the glowing orange ryatsu figure standing where the torrent once blew. It seemed to bear some resemblance to Naruto, though it was difficult to tell because it was morphing, of all things. The ryatsu figure, which the hollows now realized was their king, was rapidly going from a quadrupedal being into a bipedal being, though the being was almost a silhouette, so they had trouble picking out what was happening beyond that. There was a loud cracking noise, and the hollows winced, guessing that the figure was having its bones rearranged throughout the transformation process. However, the figure didn't morph anymore after that, and it howled towards the Hueco Mundo crescent moon, before slamming its orange limbs into the dirt and drawing up an enormous cloud of dust that obscured the view of it from others. But beyond that cloud, the orange ryatsu coating the thing's body was fading, and when the dust cloud dispersed completely, the hollows took in their king's new form. He stood on 2 legs, but managed to look just as feral as when he was in a juches. He was slightly on the short side, measuring in at only about 5.5 feet tall, though that didn't make him look any less menacing. The vulpine mask that adorned his face had flattened out, losing its snout, while its ears rose vertically in points instead of being combed back along his snout. There was red war paint that ran down from the ears, to below his eyes and towards the bridge of his nose, where they curled into twin spirals on opposite sides. His teeth were all sharp incisors, which had curled up into a toothy grin that managed to be even more psychotic now. He remained red in color, but this time the light bony armor covered every portion of his body, leaving no fur visible. Even the claws on both his hands and feet were covered in the stuff, which made them seem even sharper. His 9 tails waved around freely, not looking even slightly out of place on a body that small. They too were covered in the red armor in every portion except the tips. The tips of the tails were hollow and open, the only material there being the bare minimum structure. These had hollow, open lines running down the length of the tail into his main body. It was almost like the tips of the tail were lanterns, the flame meant to be contained within them. His 2 prominent shoulder spikes remained in place, along with numerous other spines all along his elbows, knees, and hips. But there was a completely new addition to his body on his torso. Below his hollow hole, where Kyuubi's seal once lay and on a much thinner layered portion of his body, there was an enlarged spiral of red Ryatsu. It glowed and crackled with energy, and curiously enough, his shoulder spines ran underneath his skin to connect to the outside of the spiral. The spiral was flanked by sharp points of armor that resembled a predator's jaws, which were located on the upper layer of his armor. "The Vasto Lord," muttered one of the hollows closest to the powerful hollow. The new Vasto Lord heard it, and he laughed slowly. First, just a small chuckle, but this soon evolved into full-blown laughter, which he had directed straight towards the heavens themselves. It was the happiest he had laughed in years, which was saying a lot for a hollow like this. But like anyone who stays around this particular hollow for long periods of time, it makes one on edge. Like his happiness isn't supposed to be a good thing. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to in order to show his glee towards the situation. Things were beginning to look up for him now, and at this rate, forming the most powerful kingdom in Hueco Mundo would be a snap. Naruto's evolution had stirred awake all 4 of his generals awake, and they were surprised as everyone else to see their superior as a full-on Vasto Lord. The sight was gratifying, to say the least. He turned and looked at the cave complex, his new capital. A lot of work would have to be done to this place if he ever wanted to turn it into the sprawling empire that he had wanted. Also, this battle with Drindo had opened his eyes to the worthlessness of humanoid hollows. There was no way he was going to allow any non-animal hollows in his kingdom. Animal hollows were more in touch with themselves anyway, not fancying themselves as humans. He would form the antithesis to Drindo's kingdom, the Reino Animal, a kingdom of nothing but animal hollows. This would also serve as a mockery towards the dead Vasto Lord. There was also the matter of Konoha. He wasn't satisfied with taking their lives anymore. He had to do something special for them, so he could fully enjoy his sweet revenge. He would create the perfect plan for them, no matter how long it took, no matter what methods he had to use, and no matter who he had to sacrifice. And the good news was, he had all the time in the world for it as well. To say Minato was panicking right now would be an understatement. Even if this wasn't his first time going through this, the shock value of it all had hardly diminished with experience. Besides, it's not like adding a new member to the family should ever be a bland experience, and it wasn't. It was always a stressful, yet rewarding experience that paid off in the end. However, in his heart, Minato always knew that they would have more kids the instant he and Kushina had both learned that children could be born within the Soul Society. Though they had decided to wait a little while until they had gotten properly adjusted within the afterlife, what better time to have a kid when his wife had become the vice-captain of the 3rd Division, after their captain died and the vice-captain took his place. But it turns out that the birth experience wasn't any different from how it was in life. From the sounds of moaning and screaming inside the maternity ward, it was still painful as hell, and the woman was more or less a wild animal to her husband/lover. With a woman like Kushina, it was this times 10, which was why Minato was both battered and bruised. She had even thrown the 4th Division members who were supposed to be helping with the birth across the room. Though, in the end, despite all the jitters and pain, it was worth it to hear that first cry and the calming of the mother as the birthing process finally subsided, and he was able to breathe easily for the first time in 24 hours. Yep, all worth it to hear those first 2 cries come from over on the bed. 2 cries? He thought, slowly comprehending exactly what that meant. A 4th Division member noticed his being on the ground after being knocked away by Kushina, and quickly helped the 3rd seat of the 5th Division to his feet. She gestured over to his wife, who was happily holding 2 babies, a soft, maternal smile on her face. "Congratulations, Minato-sama," said the medical Shinigami, a soft smile on her face. "Your wife has successfully given birth to a set of twins. One a girl, and the other a boy." Minato felt his mouth run dry, as the 4th Division member allowed the former shinobi to approach the bed, and catch his first glimpse at his 2nd and 3rd children. They were both wrapped up in bundles, obscuring what type of build they had from him. But he could tell that despite being different genders, they looked almost exactly the same as one another, except for the obvious gender differences. They both had tufts of red hair on their heads, the exact same shade. The one on the left, the older twin, opened her eyes to show a soft cerulean that stared back at him with wonder. Her slightly younger brother mimicked her over to the right, his blue eyes being slightly more piercing. Minato bent down and gave both babies kisses on the foreheads, prompting them both to giggle in unison. Kushina also giggled at the display of affection, as her husband pulled back to look at all 3 of them warmly. Yet none of them, even the nurses and 4th Division members, found any words necessary to add to this touching family. Things are beginning to look up even more, Minato thought, as he turned a wistful eye to the ceiling, before turning back towards his wife so they could settle on names. 60 years later. "Story, Daddy, story," a little red-headed girl squealed, as her father carried her into her particularly large bedroom that she shared with her twin brother. Ever since Kushina had become a vice-captain 60 years ago, and had given birth to twins, the family had moved out of the Shinigami barracks, and bought their own mansion, near the other noble houses of Soul Society. Minato smiled before holding her at arm's length, placing her down on her twin bed. Her brother was already in his bed to the right of her, but he was still awake, clearly also waiting for the story his sister so coveted. Minato chuckled at the hyperactive girl, before kissing her on the forehead, walking to her brother and doing the same to him, and then moving up to the nightstand between the 2 beds. He opening the drawer, seeing the stack of books that were somewhat disorganized. "Don't worry, Akane-chan. I haven't forgotten about your story." Truth be told, the twins had already heard most of these stories several times. They were both going on 60 years old after all, even they were still mentally and physically 4 to 5 years old. Sometimes he hated how everyone here aged so slowly, but most of the time he just enjoyed the time he had with his family. "Here's a book I haven't read you, Akane-chan, Taiki-kun," he said with mild surprise, thinking that he truly had read all the children's books that had in the house. Akane started clapping enthusiastically at the thought of a new story, while Taiki merely smiled a truly radiant grin. He read over the title of the book once again, grinning and laughing to himself lightly. "I can't believe I've never read this story to you two before. It's a classic tale renowned throughout Soul Society, practically a legend in its own right," he said. Akane seemed to get even more excited, getting the feeling that she was in for a good story. Minato cleared his throat, bringing rapt attention from his 2 children. Once upon a time, the Shinigami and Soul Society lived in harmony with one another, vanquishing hollows and ferrying good souls to the afterlife, where they could live in happiness with one another. He paused. The darker aspects of the job were glossed over, but that was to be expected from a children's book. But one day a powerful Hollow King, deep from the recesses of Hueco Mundo, found his way into Soul Society, and using his army, he spread terror across the peaceful land. Both of the children gasped at the horror of the realization. Minato let a soft smile come onto his face. With great power at his command, he managed to conquer nearly all of Soul Society, and obtain what he wanted. A great key, more sought out than anything else, that could break the reincarnation cycle of souls and alter the flow of them between Soul Society, the human world, Hueco Mundo, and the realm where bad souls go. With all of his deeds done, the hollow turned to his final goal, the realm of the Spirit King, where he could awaken the key's power and bring his plan to send all the good souls to the realm of bad souls. He raised his voice for dramatic effect. Taiki looked slightly frightened, though Akane had covered her mouth in an exaggerated gasp. But as all hope was lost for both Shinigami and Hollow, a strange old Shinigami appeared in front of the Hollow. Using his formidable powers, he vanquished the King Hollow and his army back into Hueco Mundo from whence he came. Putting the key back in its rightful place, he restored order throughout the land for all souls to live happily ever after. The end, he said, showing the two children a picture of an old Shinigami fighting an angular chimera-like hollow with a crown. Akane squealed in delight at the heroic tale, jumping out of her bed and brandishing an invisible sword. It was no secret that she wanted to be a Shinigami just like her parents. Minato laughed out loud and scooped up the hyperactive girl, placing her back in the bed. "Easy there, my little Shinigami. It's just a made-up tale," he said to calm the girl down. She snuggled back underneath the covers of her bed, once again smiling at her father. "Good night, Akane Taiki. I love you," he whispered. Both kids responded with a simple "love you too, Daddy." Before they closed their eyes, and Minato wandered from the room after taking one last look at them. As he shut the door quietly, he heard Light giggling right to him. "No matter how many times I see it, that always gets me." Kushina chuckled. Minato blushed slightly, now realizing that she had been watching him read the story since the beginning. "I didn't take you as the type to get so mushy," she mused, laughing again at her husband. It was meant as a joke, of course. She had seen him read his kids' stories many times. "Well, what do you expect? Both of them are going to become fine Shinigami one day, and I want to hold on to them as long as I can, especially since," he trailed off, a look of sadness appearing on his visage. Kushina mimicked that expression, grasping the implications of what he was saying immediately. "Naruto," she trailed off like her husband, and Minato swore he could see a small tear appear in her eye. However, as soon as it had come, the sadness clouding over her expression had disappeared. She placed a hand of comfort on her husband's shoulder, which he thankfully grasped. "I know our last search for him was unsuccessful, but we shouldn't give up hope, Minato. He's out there in Soul Society somewhere. It's a large place, and we're lucky we have the resources to search for him. Most people don't get a chance like this. We can only tell ourselves that wherever he is, he's happy, and living a good and fruitful life." She whispered. "Yeah, you're right. We should count ourselves lucky we're able to see so many of the family and friends that we had in life. I just want us to be reunited with our son," he smiled sadly. "We will, Minato. We will." In the 60 years needed to build his own kingdom that rivaled Baragan's, Naruto had flourished and created a sprawling kingdom that became well known within Hueco Mundo. He had taken over numerous smaller kingdoms, many of which were run by more of Baragan's former advisors. It was no longer a kingdom, and Naruto was no longer a king. He was an emperor, and his domain was one of the greatest empires ever seen in Hueco Mundo, or the human world for that matter. The cave complex served as his capital of sorts, though it had long since become a grand palace, that while wasn't on par with the size of Baragan's, fulfilled all the basic functions needed while housing the majority of his subjects. He had built the thing out of a different, yet similar structured material than Baragan's Las Noches, to which he had found a quarry of the stuff across the ocean, in some of the new territory he had conquered. All remnants of the cave complex once being rock had completely disappeared, as he had destroyed the Great Plateau once he had the resources. Now only the Great Palace, a brilliant display of red and white, rose out of the ground, facing the sea to potentially ward off future enemies. Like Las Noches, it had a domed roof, but there were many more windows on the palace. Instead of 4 pillars flanking the cardinal directions of the compass, there was a large tower rising out of the dome. It looked almost phallic, but considering Naruto's lewd nature, this was probably intentional. It was in this phallic structure where Naruto made his throne room, so he could look out across the expanse of Hueco Mundo, almost like he was a higher being than all of them. Out of the palace at the 4 cardinal directions, there were significant large chambers jutting out of the main palace, and these served as the chambers of Naruto's 4 generals, who had loyally served him all these years, even the rebellious Neutra. However, these 4 hollows were just about the only beings in Hueco Mundo who served him loyally. Living conditions were not good for the rest of the hollow in the kingdom, and most of them followed him out of pure fear rather than respect. The things he had done made even a ruthless hollow cringe. And out of the 4 generals, Grimmjow and Neutra were just as ruthless as Naruto. Ulquiorra didn't care about the meager lives of those he considered trash, and Harabel was blissfully in the dark about her king's ways. His boundaries spread all the way back west towards Las Noches, stopping where Barragan had drawn the line between the 2 rivaling kingdoms. He even managed to cross the ocean fully, and take some of the new land that lay across it, where an entirely different set of hollows cut off from the other mainland existed. Despite all his successes on the front of Hueco Mundo, the Kitsune Vasto Lord was thinking about things, sulking as he did so. The last 60 years of his life, he had spent doing nothing but taking more land, resources, and hollows so he could stick it to the Soul Society, and more importantly, Konoha. This was the Reino Animal, a kingdom of nothing but animal-based hollows. All the humanoid ones he had expelled or even exterminated long ago, when he had decided that they weren't of use to him anymore. Not that they were ever of much use in the first place. Drindo had been a moron to believe that they were inherently superior to animal hollows. In the highest tower overlooking the vast plain and the sea in front of them, a small hollow sat on his ornate throne in a relaxed position, tossing a rock into the air and catching it easily. Do I have enough power to challenge Soul Society right now? He asked himself, there being no guards or anything of the like in his throne room. He didn't need anything like that, especially when he said his plans out loud and didn't want anyone to hear them. Konoha would definitely go down right now if I decided to attack them, but I've been so busy these past decades that I haven't even thought of how I'm going to go beyond just killing them. But who I am kidding saying I have enough power to eliminate Soul Society? Not even. He turned his gaze to the bookshelf he had behind his throne, the most prominent one sticking out severely. He had enough power to thwart the Soul Society, not before he was stopped by the Sotaishu. I definitely need to build more power and intelligence. Intelligence is an important factor as well. If I could just archive the list of current captains and their abilities, that would make this whole thing so much fucking easier. But where am I gonna get something like that? He mused to himself, before lounging down sideways upon his throne. Ugh, this is so frustrating. Barragan's stupid ass has prevented me from moving against anyone else in the past couple years, now that he's finally labeled me as a threat. It won't help me at all if I stagnate in my growth of power, and it looks like I'm no closer to figuring out just how to turn a hollow into an Aaronkar than I was before, even as we did find that orb almost 50 years ago. Indeed, one of the Bolas de Evolution lay tightly secure on a pedestal directly to the right of Naruto's throne. However, despite being in the possession of one of the sacred orbs, Rapporo's notes on Aaronkarization were very complex, and neither he nor the other top hollows in the Reino Animal could make sense of it. It would be so much easier to figure this out if I had a professional scientist or accomplished researcher within my kingdom. That is, if I didn't hate their very guts considering that they remind me of Konoha with how experiment-happy they are. But it's tearing me apart how I can't get any closer to the secret of Aaronkarization. The Fox Vasto Lord hopped off his throne and began pacing around the room. This feeling is just as bad as when I was trapped within. Barragan say, Nah, Naruto trailed off, as something clicked within Naruto's mind at that very moment. Thoughts of Konoha, the arena, and scientists all melded together within his mind to form an idea. A brilliant, yet awful idea had hatched itself within his head at the thought of all of these things. A cruel grin alit underneath his mask, and the taken aback hollow sat down on his throne, as his eyes widened further as the idea began to hatch itself more and more within his head. It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. It would be the best thing for him to do. It would take a long time for him to get this together, but it would all be worth it in the end to see this plan come into fruition. He charged some Ryatsu into this strange panel he had on the left side of his throne, watching as an image of the interior of his palace appeared in midair. Overall, the interior of the palace looked somewhat similar to Barragan's, with the clear night sky visible overhead. It lacked any visible settlements or features outside the doors to the chambers of the four generals. The majority of his populace lived underground, in colonies or groups in an environment similar to the cave complex the place had been before. The only time normal subjects of his were allowed on the surface was when they were charged with subjugated more hollows. Most of them ate each other underground, as there were no laws of any kind against the eating of your comrades. Because of this, the palace was always in chaos underground, despite the pristine image of order above the surface. He talked into the screen, knowing that his voice would be reverberated all throughout the palace, reaching everyone except for Harabel, who he had been keeping in the dark about his more unpleasant side. Hell, he didn't use her much, and she preferred to keep to herself in her own wing of the palace. Attention, all my wonderful fuckheads out there. This is your awesome emperor speaking, and I'd like to talk about the direction I'm going to be taking this place from now. Obviously, we need to raise our military power even further, but I'm instilling a little side project that we're going to pursue. You see, for those of you who don't know, I have a little, teensy tiny, itty-bitty problem with my old village from when I was a human. Naturally, I want to see it disappear off the face of the earth. He snorted, laughing loudly, as many hollows underground once again questioned their emperor's sanity. But I'm not satisfied with simply taking their lives. Oh no 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 no! I want to go for something far beyond that. He roared dramatically, before he squealed giddily, before panning through the holographic image about the barren surface world. Well, I guess anywhere will do, he mused, stroking his mask. Anyway, I know you all just finished building the palace a few years, but we're going to construct a few more features along the surface. You understand, right? I knew you would. He laughed, knowing full well that there would be many hollows who would not be happy with this. I'm also opening up a new position of power besides my 4 military generals and the Hollow Council, which has no power, just filled with whiny idiots who think they make a difference, he thought to himself before chuckling in his mind. He only made that council so he could stop listening to all his bitches subjects. Maybe I'll kill them all later. This will be the Reino Animal's own institution of scientific research, but to form such a thing, I need scientists. And someone with greater scientific knowledge to lead the institute. To stress the importance of this, the leader has the exact same amount of power as one of my generals. So I order you to go out there and bring me scientists to work for me. Those who do will surely be handsomely rewarded with enough hollows to cause one to evolve. He shouted, making sure to give them all an incentive to go out and find someone with scientific knowledge. Did I just say enough hollows to cause one to evolve? I meant that they will be rewarded with death, but oh well. He panned the screen to see some hollows looking very interested at the prospect of free food, and already a few of them were beginning to shuffle out of their homes and out to the surface. Still, this is going to take a very long time. Probably 10 years to gather all the necessary scientists, and another 30 to finish all the construction, and there's no telling how long it will take the researchers to finish the projects that I order them to do. I suppose Konoha and the Shinigami are going to live for another day. He thought sullenly, the long wait that this project has effectively destroying any semblance of a good mood that he had had before. All I have to do is wait.